5 climate megaprojects that might just save the world. When it comes to fighting climate change, many strategies require relatively small actions from large numbers of people. It's about millions of us installing heat pumps, switching to electric vehicles, eschewing meat in our diets, and so on. But given the sheer scale of the challenge, some insist we need to think bigger and bolder too. They are talking about audacious infrastructure projects that would cost billions and carry high risks, but could, if they work out, have a truly transformative impact on our stuttering efforts to get carbon emissions down to zero and even mitigate the worst effects of current warming. Here we examine 5 of the most promising green megaprojects, weighing up their prospects and exploring what would need to happen next to make good on them. Realistically, what kind of impact could they have? And can we pull them off? Number 5. Launch a solar power station into space. Clouds may be a source of inspiration for poets and romantics, but for solar power engineers, they are nothing but a nuisance. No matter how efficient the solar panel is, when the sky clouds over, power output drops to nearly nothing. Move that solar panel into space, however, and this problem disappears. In orbit, a satellite can bask in the perpetual glow of sunlight and generate electricity at maximum capacity nearly all the time. Engineers have been talking up the idea of a solar power station in space for decades, and when you look at how much energy it could produce, you can see why. A 10-kilometer-wide solar panel in geostationary orbit could produce 570 terawatt-years of energy, according to Ian Cash at International Electric Company. That would be enough to supply 10 billion people at 6 times the current US levels of energy consumption per capita. For comparison, the UK's total electricity demand in 2022 was 320 terawatt-hours. So, why haven't we done it? For a long time, the answer was cost. A spacecraft with solar panels extending for kilometers would be heavy, and launching all the required equipment into space would be horrendously expensive. But with the arrival of reusable rockets built by companies such as SpaceX, that price has tumbled. Estimates suggest that it could cost just $5,000 per kilogram to send materials into geostationary orbit, where space solar power stations would need to sit, with SpaceX's upcoming Starship launch system. That is about half of what it costs with our most economical rocket technology today. The advent of reusable launch vehicles completely changed the economics, says Martin Solto, co-CEO of Space Solar, a UK company dedicated to the commercial delivery of space-based solar power. Whatever the impact, interest in space-based solar power is growing. As well as the Caltech project, Japan and China have plans to build and test prototype solar power satellites in the next few years. At the European Space Agency, the Solaris program is also investigating the concept's feasibility. If the UK puts its shoulder behind this, it might realistically aim to get about 30% of its electricity from space by the early 2040s, says Solta. Stuart Clark. Number 4. Build a set of energy islands. If Denmark has its way, the cold and choppy waters of the North Sea will soon be home to a new island known as Vindo. Not a seabird and sand kind of island, but one of concrete, steel, and clean energy galore. The plans for Vindo are part of a broader scheme to solve the energy crisis by building artificial energy islands to support vast wind farms. Europe already has a lot of offshore wind turbines, but energy industry insiders reckon we need vastly more if we are to successfully transition to net zero. In the next 25 years, many countries are looking at building 10 to 15 times as much as we've built in the past 35 years, says Samuel Majid at Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, a green investment fund. That's a huge challenge, and to succeed, we have to do things differently. Wind power has 2 main drawbacks. One is that the power generation is intermittent, meaning it can be hard to match supply to demand. Another is that the power must be transported via cables to where it is needed on land, and the infrastructure required is wildly expensive, especially if each farm is connected through a dedicated cable, as at present. Number 3. Stabilize the Doomsday Glacier. The Thwaites Glacier in Antarctica, often dubbed the Doomsday Glacier, is in deep trouble. Since 2000, it has lost more than 1 trillion tons of ice. The speed of its flow has also doubled in 30 years, meaning twice as much ice is being spewed into the ocean. Some think it is on a runaway path to collapse. Even more alarmingly, this glacier buttresses much of the ice sheet covering West Antarctica. If Thwaites fails, the worry is that it will precipitate a widespread melting of the ice, a huge concern because this vast ice sheet contains enough water to raise global sea levels by up to 5 meters. That will seriously threaten cities like New York, Shanghai, Calcutta, and Hamburg, says Anders Levermann at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research in Germany. Twila Moon at the National Snow and Ice Data Center in Boulder, Colorado, says that these geoengineering ideas give the sense of assisting with the climate crisis while failing to do that. But Moore doesn't see it that way. No one is saying this is a substitute for tackling emissions, he says. It's an extra tool, The best we can hope for is to avoid this collapse process so the ice sheets gracefully retreat without very rapid sea level rise. Ultimately, Moore thinks the stakes are high enough that these ambitious ideas are worth entertaining. I don't think civilization could manage without the West Antarctic ice sheet, he says. It's an existential threat. Alice and George. Number 2. Regreen the Sinai Peninsula. Once upon a time, the Sinai Peninsula was a subtropical paradise. This area in modern-day Egypt boasted rivers weaving through forests and grasses sparkling with dew. Then, around 10,000 years ago, the hills turned brown, rivers dried up, and dusty sands drove away the remnants of life. Changes in Earth's orbit may have been partly to blame, but human intervention felling trees and grazing animals is probably what tipped the balance. What if we can return the Sinai to its former Eden? In principle, the reintroduced vegetation would not only suck a huge chunk of carbon from the atmosphere, but also reinvigorate local water cycles, ushering in desperately needed rainfall and allowing flora and fauna to thrive. According to the weather makers, this would improve the water quality and restore fish stocks. Both would be a welcome boost to the fishing industry in North Sinai, a region affected by poverty, terrorism, and the war in neighboring Gaza. Together with the planting of salt-tolerant species, the excavation would also help enlarge the surrounding wetlands, creating a better habitat for migratory birds. The sediment itself, being full of organic matter, could be worked into the land, improving its fertility. There is only one thing missing: fresh water. Those at the weather makers have several ideas of how to capture it. One is to use fog collectors, taut nets erected at high altitudes on which atmospheric water vapor can condense and trickle down into reservoirs. Another idea is to store the excavated wet sediment in huge lowland polytunnels, where its water content can evaporate before condensing on the structures and dribbling down to irrigate plants. Once the plants become sufficiently mature, the polytunnels can be moved elsewhere. Eventually, once a critical mass of land is regreened, the region's biosphere will naturally tip back to its former state and a self-sustaining water cycle will continue all the hard work, or so the idea goes. Francesco Posada, a climatologist at the University of Quebec in Montreal, cautiously welcomes the proposal but thinks that the knock-on effects for the climate elsewhere need to be studied. This sort of geoengineering can be good for the local population, he says, but it's worth investigating in more detail to avoid unintended consequences. Number 1. Suck 8 megatons of CO2 from the air each year. Over the next few decades, it won't be enough to merely avoid putting more greenhouse gases into the air. We also need to actively remove carbon dioxide to avoid the worst effects of global warming. There are plenty of ways to do that, including planting trees or restoring seagrass beds. But if you want to mop up CO2 in an easy-to-quantify way with few uncertainties, then direct air capture is a solid, if expensive, option. The idea is to absorb CO2 from the air and then release a stream of the concentrated gas that can either be buried in the ground or sold as a useful product, such as synthetic jet fuel. In that sense, you can think of it as recycling CO2. According to the International Energy Agency, IEA, we will need to suck 80 megatons of CO2 out of the atmosphere each year by 2030 to hit net zero emissions by 2050. That amount of the gas is equivalent to what is produced by 185 million barrels of oil. It weighs nearly 15 times as much as the Great Pyramid of Giza. This is a huge step up from where we are now. Today, there are 18 direct air capture pilot plants in operation globally, collectively sucking up just 0.01 megaton of CO2 per year. The biggest of these is run by Swiss company Climeworks in Iceland. Its Orca facility can soak up 4,000 tons per year. A much larger effort is underway in Texas. The company 1.5 broke ground in April 2023 for an industrial plant called Stratos, which aims to extract 500,000 tons of CO2 from the air per year starting in 2025. A handful of megaton-scale plants are on the drawing board, but the pace needs to be dramatically accelerated. To reach our goal of 80 events per year by 2030, we would need to build about 10 such plants a year starting now. That is epic, but viable. It's technologically feasible, says Katie Lebling, an environmental analyst at the World Resources Institute in Washington, D.C. So this is the end of our today's video. Do you like it? Kindly give your valuable response in our comment section below, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more interesting and informative videos.